I've used documentation for a variety of things in my life and my career. Documentation is awesome, and I advocate for it all the time. I have examples from my own life, and I really want to talk about and how I used a wiki, how I discovered wiki, right? Wiki was my savior. I was the build guy. On a team of about 17 people, I was the build and integration guy. And so I became the bottleneck for information about what code was being built, when it was going to be put out to the test servers, and all that. This was in pre-continuous integration days. And I discovered Wiki as a way to deflect and defend myself from all of those interruptions. So I set up a wiki, and whenever someone would ask me what the status was of the build, I would say, hey, the answer's over here on this wiki page. And by the way, you can subscribe to changes to that page, and you'll get an update by email when it changes. See, it wasn't easy, because at first people still wanted to come ask me directly. They didn't really want to be brushed off as they felt when I would tell them to go to the wiki. But once people got into that mindset, it was okay. And as long as I was good at telling them to go to the wiki, I could reduce my interruptions, and that gave me enough freedom and time and flexibility to implement a real continuous integration system, which then would just be correct all the time. So using documentation in that way really helped me out. It also introduced me to MediaWiki, which I became kind of enamored with. I started extending wikis and using them for a variety of things. I ended up eventually getting commit access to the MediaWiki core. I made a bunch of extensions that people liked, and it got me my next couple of jobs. I spent 3 years on the knowledge management team of a company called Vistaprint. That was a lot about documentation and documentation systems. Well, I now work for Brightcove. Brightcove is a really fantastic place to work, and I've had the opportunity to use documentation to my advantage in several cases. So we had a customer who wanted to implement buffering, right? So they have streaming media, and it's streaming on purpose so that if somebody scans forward an hour into a 2-hour movie, they don't have to download the first hour. They can just skip right to there. That's the whole point of streaming media. But they wanted to be able to buffer because their customers had sometimes low bandwidth, and they might want to pause the movie, let it buffer, and then start playing back. So they wanted effectively indefinite buffers, right? And I won't go into all the details of how this was hard because it's not necessarily relevant to talk about documentation. But it was really hard. And I was on it at first, and I think we underestimated how hard it was going to be. So at this time we used week or 2 week long sprints, the team did, and as we were coming to the end of the sprint, it was clear that this story was in jeopardy, right? I kept feeling like I was almost there, but it was always just a little bit out of my reach, and I would find something else that was not working. So with a couple of days left, I started documenting everything. I wrote out everything that I had tried, what worked, what didn't work. I had copious links to documentation that I had found from the field and links to bug reports, the whole nine. And I took the 5 remaining major issues, gave them names, gave them steps to reproduce, and presented it to the team. The team, who had been freeing up because we were towards the end of the sprint, had capacity to swarm on that list, work on it, and within a day or two we had most of the issues solved and the remaining ones scoped out. So in that particular case, documenting helped us deliver a feature that otherwise would have continued to slip or possibly not get delivered at all. As a side note, the CTO of the company decided, unbeknownst to me, to take that document and forward it to the customer. And it turned out the customer was very happy to see it because it showed them that we were actively investigating implementing their feature. We were working really hard, that we had run into real technical problems that had real roots in reality. There were other people who had experienced the same, as evidenced by the links. They were happy to see that work was being done, and they were happy to see that we had a command of the issue and that we were on track to eventually solve it. So even though we were a little late in delivering the feature, the customer was happy because they could see that we were actually working on it. It wasn't just radio silence. So that's a side effect of documenting. You set out to write a document for one reason, and it can produce something else. What is the purpose of documentation? What is the purpose of code? A lot of us work for software companies, right? And I use that term loosely because virtually any company nowadays is a software company. The software industry is increasingly every industry, right? And so we fancy ourselves software companies. We produce software, but that's not really what we produce. And to understand why, I'd like to point to an old adage which says, functionality is an asset, code is a liability, right? This acknowledges that while code itself has a maintenance burden, right? Any line of code could have a bug in it. The more lines of code you have, the more code you have to sift through when you're looking for something, right? There's a very real maintenance cost for every line of code you have. However, the executing of that code produces functionality which you can sell to your customers and make a good profit doing. So it's sort of, so to speak, a kind of necessary evil. And so if there was going to be an equivalent saying for documentation, I would say that understanding is an asset and documentation is a liability. Documentation can get out of date. Documentation can sometimes be wrong or misleading, especially if it's old. And so you have a real maintenance burden for keeping documents up to date and correct. However, reading a document produces understanding. And so in the case I just gave with regards to Brightcove's customer, the understanding had real value to them because they could understand that we were working really hard on the problem, that we understood what was going on, and that communication was incredibly valuable. The document itself, the words, are a liability because they still exist, right? That article still exists. People can go back and read it. Whether or not we've solved those problems isn't completely captured. It's certainly out of date, right? So it's both liability, but the execution or the reading of that is an asset. And so both of these things lead to kind of a larger, more holistic look at what is the product, what is it we produce. So we think of ourselves as software companies, we think of ourselves as producing software, but that's really not what we produce. The product is the customer experience, the whole thing. It's the research they do before they buy, it's their interaction with the sign-in page, it's the 10-minute tutorial, it's their call to customer service. That's the product. That whole thing is the product. Okay? And so from that perspective, with code as a liability and documentation as a liability, but understanding and functionality as assets, it becomes clear that we don't want to think of documentation as producing words, just as we don't think of software as producing code, right? Software produces functionality, tested, assured functionality, right, with a variety of other characteristics. Documentation is the same thing. It produces understanding. That sort of documentation thinking, that what you're trying to produce is understanding and documentation is simply the vector by which you get there, allows you to do some more creative things. So, for example, I carry around an HPDA. I'll show you what that looks like. Who has heard of these? It's basically a bunch of 3x5 cards held together with a binder clip, right? Something like this. You've heard of these? Who has these? Does anybody have one? Right? Okay, cool. Yeah, so I've carried around one of these for years and years, and what it allows me to do is, whether I have internet connection or not, whether I have a computer or not, whether I have 3G access on my phone or not, I can document something in a Word. I can note to myself. I can create future understanding for myself of what's going on right now. Right? And so in a sense, it's a form of documentation in the sense that it creates future understanding for me. So think about your audience, right? Your audience can be yourself. If your audience is yourself, then that's fine too, and then you can have those happy accidents. On a 3x5 card, it's a little harder, but if it was written in a document that you saved off to your own private repository somewhere, you could always dredge that back up and email it off to somebody, right? To help them understand, to produce understanding in someone else. From that perspective, an email is also a form of documentation, right? Because it produces understanding in others. It also tends to live forever, right? Emails never go away. I'm a technical author. I've co-authored one book. I'm working on my next one. That's taking my understanding and repackaging it in a form book that produces understanding in others. And that has value for them, and they're willing to pay for it. So, again, the product is not the words. The words are, in fact, a liability because as I'm writing this book, Effective Node.js, new versions of Node are coming out. So every line that I write that's targeting the current latest release is a liability for future readers who come across it later. However, the understanding that the book produces in readers is an asset that people are willing to pay for. The product of documentation is understanding. And if you think of the product, the whole product, as being that entire customer experience, it becomes much more obvious that documentation thinking should be part of the whole software development cycle. Back in the late 1990s, software development was very linear, right? And I worked at a company that featured this very sequential, factory-oriented development process. Requirements came in from somewhere. We would develop them on our team consisting entirely of developers. We would throw that code over the wall, and a remote team in India would test it overnight and come back to us with whatever was going wrong. We would then, fix whatever and hand it off to the teams that would actually do the installation and maintenance and things of that nature. It was very, very sequential, right? And this is kind of how software was done for a while. And that has given way in the 2000s to the rise of Agile, right? This is not news to anybody. Instead of having that very waterfall-esque, factory-oriented model of tasks happening in serial, we have an iterative model where we try to get something out the door and then make it better and make it better and make it better. The interesting note about that change in process is that it also precipitated a change in organizational structure. So whereas previously your development team might be solely a set of developers, once the process of developing software was an integrated circle, it made sense to have an integrated team. So it made sense to have a team where you might have a couple of developers, a couple of quality assurance people, maybe somebody with design chops, and have a more integrated experience. So fast forward today. So now we're in the world of post-Agile. We don't stick dogmatically to the rituals of Scrum or of XP, but instead we focus on continuously improving our process by, retrospecting on it and trying out things like Kanban for limiting work in progress as opposed to a strict, sprint-based workflow, right? These are the types of things we experiment with. But documentation in a lot of companies is still that separate piece, right? It's still the thing you throw over the wall, right? It's still tacked on at the end after the product nominally is done, okay? And I think that just as we saw a change in process that moved the software design and development cycle into a tighter loop, and that precipitated organizational change, I think we'll see that same thing here. So as we start to pull in documentation thinking into the software development and design process, it makes sense to augment organizationally the team where you have software engineers who are focused on building functionality. That's their job. You have quality assurance engineers whose job it is to think about quality and ensure that it is good. You also need to incorporate into that documentation thinking, people who care deeply about documentation and making sure it's correct, so that is not just a thing you slap on at the end, but an integrated part in thinking about the whole product, which includes the entire customer experience. I don't think that trend is going to stop with documentation either. I think that we should also see that happen with elements like customer service. And other speakers at this conference have talked about how their holistic software engineering approach has brought more of that perspective to members of the team. So I think those are good signs, and I think that will continue. the takeaway that I would encourage you to take away would be that if you think of the product as the software, it's easy to throw documentation over the wall. If you think of the product as the entire customer experience, it becomes much more clear that documentation thinking deserves a seat at the table and should be an integral part of your day-to-day design and development process.